Chapter 7. Shaul's Foolish Oaths. From 1 Shemuel, chapter 14, 24 through 52. In characteristic Hebrew fashion, the ancient narrator of the events on this great day of triumph records the personal folly of Shaul. He tells of the spiritual mistakes made by Yasharel's new king. Unlike most modern nations, where there is a distinct cleavage between believers and state, in the Hebrew economy, their monarch was also expected to be a strong spiritual leader. In a positive way, he provided the spiritual standard for those under his dominion. With a vain show of supposed spiritual zeal, Shaul ordered his men to fast until sundown. It was sheer stupidity. Sometimes, locked in ferocious hand-to-hand combat, his armed warriors, in hot pursuit of the enemy, needed all the support and stamina they could derive from food and drink wherever they might find it. Jonathan, of course, being away on his daring escapade with his armor-bearer, knew nothing of the curse. While hot on the trail of the fleeing Philistines, he came across some honeycombs, dripping with the sweet nectar of the bees. Immediately, he paused long enough to enjoy the delicacy that could revive his energy and quicken his weary mind. The honeycombs were scattered widely at random throughout the wooded terrain. It was a part of the battle rations that primitive men of war often carried into combat. African tribes still do this. The entire comb is consumed, beeswax, grubs, honey, and all. In their terror and consternation at the fearsome earthquake, as well as their own pandemonium, the Philistines in haste jettisoned the honeycombs, leaving them as spoils of war for the Yashreelites. It could have been a tremendous bonus to Shaul's men. Instead, it was an irksome irritation, for they had become faint and weak with the strenuous combat of the day. With an intense flash of spiritual perception, Jonathan saw the folly of his father's oath. How much greater would have been Yasharel's conquest today if all the warriors could have eaten freely of the enemy's spoils, as I have. See 1 Shemuel 14:30. Jonathan knew full well that because the warriors were weak from exertion and faint from hunger, their triumph over the Philistines was less than it might have been. This could have been one of the most memorable victories in Yashreel's history. It might have well been a day when once for all the Philistines were vanquished as a formidable foe. This should have spelled the end to their never-ending attacks. Instead, many of the enemy escaped from the Yashreelites. They were able to return to the sanctuary of their own territory. There, they would regroup again to await another opportunity to launch a new invasion of Shaul's territory. When they did return to attack, Shaul and all his men would be intimidated. Only a young shepherd lad would be brave enough to face their might. The reason for Shaul's rash action must be attributed to his intense self-preoccupation. He saw the Philistine invasion as a personal attack on himself. It was, he was sure, an insult to his position as a monarch. With the typical stance of a deranged schizophrenic, he felt this was a personal vendetta. He did not have the broad view of a true statesman who saw the peril of his people, much less the honor of Yahuwah at stake in the conflict. Shaul wanted only one thing. That was revenge, not for his nation, but for his own whimsy. He was a man of mixed emotions and miserable moods, all of them fermented in the pit of his own selfish self-interest and stubborn waywardness. The remarkable aspect of this ominous day was that Shaul had sufficient influence with his men that most of them complied with his commands as absurd as they seemed. But as the day wore on, the gnawing hunger and burning thirst under the sweltering sun could not be denied. First one, then another, like rabid predators leaping on their hopeless prey, the Yashreelites began to fall on the calves, sheep, and oxen left behind by the Philistines. In an orgy of slaughter and wanton butchery, they killed the animals, gorging on the raw flesh, drinking the hot, salty blood that spurted from the severed veins and arteries. It is a sight I have seen firsthand amongst the Maasai of East Africa. The rapid fire sequence of events that night are bound to go down in Yashriel's history as among the most bizarre on record. From the most ancient times, dating as far back as the flood in Noah's time, Yahuwah had strictly forbidden the eating of animal flesh with blood in it. See Genesis 9:4. Again, in the precepts of the Levitical law under Moshe, this principle was proclaimed. See Leviticus 17:10 through 14. The concept, clearly understood by Yasharel, was that there was life in the blood. To offer a sacrifice suitable for the propitiation of sin against Yahuwah, it was essential that an innocent animal victim be slain. Its spilled blood or poured out life being offered as a unique substitute for the offender's new life. All of this looked forward to and prefigured the perfect life of Yahusha himself, being poured out in the shedding of his blood for lost men at Calvary. Because of this, no one dared to defile himself, much less desecrate the heavenly ordinance of the Most High by consuming blood. But Shaul's men were tearing the raw flesh with their teeth and slaking their fierce thirst with blood in wild abandon. Even Shaul was outraged and aghast. He saw the enormity of their transgression. In panic, he ordered a huge rock to be rolled into view for him. Perhaps he could stand on it to gain the attention of his men. He commanded that every warrior bring his beast before him to be slaughtered in the appropriate way. Then, for the first time in his life, Shaul himself erected an altar to Yahuwah. It was a case of too little, too late, for in his folly he had failed to seek Yahuwah's direction in his decisions. Still, he felt sure Yasharel should press the attack all night against the Philistines. His priest suggested it would be wise to seek Yahuwah's guidance. Would an overnight pursuit succeed? The answer was not forthcoming. There was no clear word from Yahuwah. Enraged and chagrined by the supernatural silence attending his petition, Shaul flew into a fit of rage. Someone had sinned, he was sure. In blind rage, he declared vehemently that the culprit must be found, and even if it was his own son, he should pay dearly with his life. The monstrous absurdity of Shaul's behavior baffles us. It scarcely seems possible Yasharel's king could be so spiritually inept. Almost all of his men had transgressed against Yahuwah that day. It was obvious. He himself had sinned against his fellows by the extreme folly of his imposed fast. Yet now he looked for some innocent scapegoat upon whom he could place the blame for his own misdeeds. We look on in horror as Shaul calls for Ermin and Thummim to be used in finding the offender. The outrageous monarch had forgotten that anyone who chose to discover heavenly guidance this way without first being set apart themselves would receive a false message. So, when in the darkness of that dreadful night, with the campfire flames dancing up to cast weird shadows over the masked men, Jonathan's name was drawn. It was as if an evil spirit from Shaul had spoken. not Yahuwah. It was true. Only Jonathan had tasted the honey that day. But it was equally true that only he had been totally ignorant of his father's foolish curse. He was a man, the only man present in this macabre setting, utterly innocent of any wrongdoing or sin. Yet now, in violent mental derangement, Shaul shouted that he be put to death. It was all a part of the man's perverse nature that the innocent should suffer to atone for the sinister evil of the lawless. The Savior of his people should be punished for the gross stupidity and evil offenses of others. Only the loyalty of his fellow warriors on this grim night preserved Jonathan from a grisly end at his father's own ferocious hands. They insisted his life be spared from Shaul, but only by a mere hair's breadth did he escape from the twisted, tormented spirit of one totally out of touch with the Almighty. There are stern lessons for all of us here. Far too often, men and women try to pin the blame for their misfortunes on others. They look for scapegoats to bear the brunt of their own evil. Often, by a pious parade of supposedly spiritual activity, they endeavor to cover up their own inadequacies. It deceives no one. We often forget the simple fact that the most jolly men and women among us are the least spectacular. Like Jonathan, they are the quiet ones who, in company with Yahusha, move humbly through life, achieving great things for Yahuwah. Their characters are sterling, their conduct beyond reproach. After this dreadful ordeal, Shaul and his people, instead of routing the enemy, scattered and returned to their homes. What might have been a momentous overthrow of the Philistines turned out to be but an incentive for them to attack Yasharel again. Word of the inconclusive battle spread to all the surrounding enemy nations. The end result was that Shaul, instead of enjoying a rule of strength and peace, found himself caught up in constant conflict with the Amorites, the kings of Zobah, the Philistines, as well as Yasharel's ancient foes, the Amalekites. The wars of attrition went on and on through the years of his troubled monarchy. And just as Shemuel had warned, Yasharel before his coronation, Shaul continually recruited the finest young men he could find to reinforce his standing army. Though Yasharel now had a titular monarch as head of state, it was a disastrous exchange for the government of Yahuwah himself. The nation was in fact being ruled by a fool, whose actions were an affront to Yahuwah and a tyranny to his people. Chapter 8. Shaul's fatal disobedience to Yahuwah, from 1 Shemuel, chapter 15. Shaul had been in power over Yasharel for about 9 or 10 years when Shemuel again came to him with a special message from Yahuwah. The time had come for the Amalekites, Yasharel's ancient foes, to be annihilated once and for all. It was Amalek, the ferocious offspring of Esau, who first fought against Yasharel at Rephidim when Yahuwah delivered Yasharel from Egypt, while Moshe prayed for his people in peril with arms outstretched to Yahuwah. Young Yahusha and his fledgling army had triumphed over the Amalekites on the desert floor below. See Exodus 17. At the first flush of victory in the wilderness waste, Yasharel had been warned that there would be an ongoing vendetta with Amalek from generation to generation. Now, for 400 years, the rivalry had raged on. So Shemuel's implicit orders were that the day had come when Yasharel should destroy this enemy, even to the last living person, along with all their livestock. Absolutely nothing should be spared. It was a drastic decree that demanded the most implicit compliance. Shaul mustered a formidable force of 200,000 footmen from Yasharel and 10,000 warriors from Yehuda. With a daring drive, he swept south and west across the Negev desert as far as the outermost boundaries of Egypt. His strategy succeeded. Amalek was completely encircled. Like a bird caught in a snare, Agag, the king of Amalek, and his forces fell into the hands of Shaul. Only the Kenites, an offshoot of Amalek, who had been favorable to Yasharel in the past, were spared. Yet in truth, the annihilation of the enemy was not executed as Yahuwah commanded, for Shaul decided to return in triumph, bringing with him Agag as a prize trophy of war. In addition, his victorious forces had persuaded Shaul to spare the finest of the enemy livestock as spoils from the combat. Their facetious argument was that the fine fat cattle, sheep, and goats would make admirable sacrifices. The best of the camels and asses would bear home other booty that seemed far too good to destroy. It was in direct disobedience to Yah's command. Shaul deliberately ignored the explicit instructions of the Most High. Shaul and his triumphant troops marched home in a blaze of proud and heady self-assurance. Agag was in chains, and they were all richer with their spoils of war. The rugged old prophet Shemuel, keenly attuned to the spirit of Yahuwah, knew full well of Shaul's action, even though he was encamped in the desert waste. He knew Agag had been spared. He knew herds of livestock were being driven along the dusty trails back to Yasharel. With anguished spirit over Shaul's intransigence, the old man wept before Yahuwah all night. Hot tears fell from his weary old eyes on behalf of the stubborn Shaul. He realized with bitter certainty that in his own folly, Shaul had forfeited forever his claim to the kingdom. His deliberate disobedience would mean that the monarchy would be torn from his grasp to be given to another ruler, whom Yahuwah would choose to supplant Shaul. Despite his agony of the long sleepless night, Shemuel rose at dawn to go out and meet the returning army. Shaul, flushed with his own apparent success, was in an expansive mood. He greeted Shemuel with a great show of esteem and self-congratulation. "Blessed be you of Yahuwah. I have performed the commandment of Yahuwah." From 1 Shemuel 15:13. Shaul's brazen attempt to bluff the sage old seer only deepened Shemuel's despair. He already knew much more than Shaul ever guessed. The lowing of the cattle and bleating of the sheep in the background were confirmation of the king's calumny. He was digging himself a pit of deception that would spell his own destruction. With the Ruach of Yahuwah surging strongly through him in tremendous intensity, the prophet confronted Shaul with his awful peril in disobeying Yahuwah. Despite his deep personal affection for the new king, Shemuel served a higher sovereign, and now he stood unshaken before the handsome giant towering over him. "Why did you not obey the voice of Yahuwah? Why did you fly upon the spoil? Why have you done such evil?" See verse 19. His words were charged with pathos, heavy with agony. Shaul pulled himself up to his full height. He appeared as a mountain of manhood overshadowing the stooped and feeble old prophet. "I have disobeyed Yahuwah," he thundered angrily. "I have gone where he sent me. I have destroyed the Amalekites. I have brought Agag here. The people have spared livestock to sacrifice to your Yahuwah." See verse 20 and 21. It was a daring, bold-faced attempt to vindicate himself. He was confident his commendable conduct far outweighed the less important fact that he had failed to carry out his commission. But Shemuel was not to be swayed. He was fearless in speaking emphatically for Yahuwah. He was not intimidated by the towering monarch before him, and the words which now came from his spirit were like sword thrust plunged into Shaul's stubborn soul. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken to Yahuwah's commands better than the fat of rams. Because you have rejected the word of Yahuwah, he has also rejected you from being king. 1 Shemuel 15:22 through 23. The bold facade had been stripped from Shaul. Suddenly, all his defenses were down. The stabbing impact of Shemuel's declaration shattered his self-assurance. I have sinned, he admitted half-heartedly, without deep remorse or profound contrition. But honor me with your presence as I worship your Yahuwah before this people. See verses 24 and 25. Not wishing to humiliate the king in public, Shemuel consented to this request. But before doing so, he had turned from the distraught monarch, tore his robe in a show of despair, then proclaimed, Yahuwah has rent the kingdom from you this day and given it to a neighbor of yours who is better suited to be king. From verse 28. Already Shaul was a king in eclipse. In less than 10 years, he had passed the zenith of his prowess with both Yahuwah and men. He had strutted his stuff on the little stage of his own self-centered career. It had been a pathetic performance up to this point. Now, there stood in the wings, as it were, a courageous young shepherd high in the rough hills of Judea, waiting to take center stage in Yasharel's tragic history. Before leaving Shaul to fade into the tragic and ghastly twilight of his act, Shemuel called for Agag to be brought before him. The wily desert fox was sure he would survive under Shaul's protection. What he did not reckon on was the ruthless determination of Yahuwah's prophet to perform the task assigned to Shaul. Seizing a sword in his bony hands, Shemuel rushed on Agag, decapitated him in fury, then hacked his sunburned body into a mass of blood-soaked flesh. His grim action convinced Shaul that he had failed Yahuwah. One look was worth 10,000 words. It was a dreadful end to Shaul's spiritual leadership over Yasharel. Never again during his life did Shemuel visit him. Instead, he mourned for Shaul as a son spiritually dead and now alienated from Yahuwah. The tragic sequence of events in Shaul's career reveals to us in vivid clarity certain spiritual truths not well understood by many. The first of these is that in the context of biblical history, Amalek always represents our old self-life. The continuous conflict between our so-called old nature and the new life of Yahuwah's spirit within is reflected in the ongoing struggle between Yasharel and Amalek. We are called to be done with self. We are told to use violence if necessary to eliminate our worst enemy, self. Most of us, like Shaul, simply will not do this. We pander to our own interest. We use subtle tactics to preserve our own identity. We will not be ruthless in actions of self-discipline under Yahuwah to obey him implicitly. We prefer to play little games in which we insist we are serving him while all the time pleasing ourselves. In very drastic language, Yahusha made clear what was called for in following him. He said, if your hand causes you to stumble, sever it. If your eye leads you to go astray, pluck it out. The kingdom of Yahuwah is entered by struggle of soul. It is gained in all its esteem only by those who are brave enough to be violent with their old self-life. Shaul never understood this, nor do members in the body today. Shaul could not spare Agag and the spoils of Amalek and still claim to serve Yahuwah. Yahusha said, we cannot serve both Yahuwah and Mammon. In Romans 6:11 through 14, Shaul makes it abundantly clear that if we are to be conquerors in Yahusha, the dominion of the old self-life must be shattered. In its place must come complete surrender to Yahuwah himself. This is an ongoing process, sometimes accomplished daily as we submit to the supreme sovereignty of Yahuwah's merciful Ruach. It calls for our complete compliance with Yahusha's commands. In short, to be overcomers in the conflict of our spiritual lives, we must obey Yahuwah's word without debate. Shaul deluded himself when he insisted that he had carried out Yahuwah's wishes. He had not, and he knew it. Nor can such failure to fulfill the heavenly commission be compensated for by coming up with so-called sacrifices and services. They are no substitute for obedience. Put in its plainest terms, we can say that if one wishes to rule and reign with Yahusha, which is his high calling to his people, it can only be achieved as he, in turn, rules and reigns in us. We only have power to achieve his purposes as we submit gladly to his presence at work within us. Shaul never learned this lesson. He never truly repented of his waywardness. He never fully submitted himself to Yahuwah's will. He was forever a man determined to protect his own self-interest. Ultimately, he simply became a pathetic castaway. His end was a dreadful alienation from Yahuwah. Shemuel had given him every opportunity to succeed. Yet Shaul squandered every gift from Yahuwah in folly and rebellion to end in tragedy. Chapter 9. Daud is anointed to be king, from 1 Shemuel 16. The prophet Shemuel, gaunt and haggard with the grief of his twilight years, sorrowed over the wayward Shaul. The new monarch was like a spiritual son to him. He was now like Shemuel's own blood son, far away from Yahuwah. All were burden to bear, a cause for anguish of spirit to the grand old man of Yahuwah. In the midst of his mourning, a startling word of new hope and bright cheer came from Yahuwah. Shemuel was to fill his horn with fresh oil, set out at once for Bethlehem to the household of Yesse, and there anoint one of Yesse's sons as the new sovereign in Yasharel. The heavenly instruction of the Most High was that Shemuel should still be his flaming servant. All the distress over Shaul and his own willful sons should never impede his availability to the purposes of Yahuwah. If anything, it was Shemuel's yali sorrow that kept him humble in heart and contrite in spirit. Such people Yahuwah loves to lift up and use in noble service. Without delay nor debating the issue, Shemuel, it would seem, should have been glad to go at once. But he was not, for he feared Shaul's ferocious jealousy. He trembled at the thought of the monarch's black, brooding moods. A man who was willing to slay his own son, Jonathan, in a rage, would not hesitate to behead an old man with a blow from his sword. But the command from the Almighty could not be denied. Shemuel had to go. So, driving a young heifer before him, as a sure sign that he came in peace, Shemuel went to Bethlehem. The local residents were terror-stricken. They had heard of Shemuel's burning zeal for Yahuwah's honor as he rushed on Agag and hacked him to death. What was his mission now? These were tempestuous times in the land. The nation was in upheaval. With outstretched arms and warm eyes, Shemuel spoke reassuringly to the weary elders of the country village. He was there to offer peace offerings. He was there on a heavenly assignment. He invited the heads of all the households to join him in the ritual of setting themselves apart before Yahuwah. They were to be a special people, set apart for a special purpose, the selection of a new sovereign king. Family by family they came. Finally, Jesse and 7 of his stalwart sons stood in awe before the ancient seer. In low tones, barely above a whisper, Shemuel spoke softly to Eliab, the firstborn, looked into his eyes. Surely this is the one Yahuwah anointed. But it was not to be. The man of Yahuwah's choosing was not to be appraised by his outward appearance or personal charisma. In fact, the severe rebuke that came clearly to Shemuel on this momentous occasion was, Yahuwah sees not as a man sees, for man looks on the outward appearance, but Yahuwah looks on the heart. From 1 Shemuel 16:2. Yahuwah was determined he would have a man whose will was set to do his will. This was the ultimate criterion for kingship. Son by son, all 7 of Jesse's older boys passed before Shemuel in steady succession. Any one of them, it seemed, was of such outstanding stature that they could well have served as a successor to Shaul. Yet it was not to be. Momentarily at a loss what to do next, the aged prophet may have wondered if he had come on a fool's errand, prompted by Yahuwah's Ruach to press on. He then asked Jesse if perchance he might still have another son not present. Quickly, the old father was assured that Daoud, the youngest lad in the family, was out on the range tending his flock of sheep. Send and fetch him at once, Shemuel ordered. He would not sit down or rest his weary frame until his mission was accomplished for Yahuwah. Quickly, the old father was assured that Daoud, the youngest lad in the family, was out on the range tending a flock of sheep. Send and fetch him at once, Shemuel ordered. He would not sit down or rest his weary frame until his mission was accomplished for Yahuwah. He was determined to carry out his charge without delay. When Daoud came in from the hills, there was about him a splendid aura of young manhood at its best. Fresh air, sunshine, and the Spartan life of a shepherd had bronzed his body, hardened his strong muscles, and brightened his beautiful eyes. He bore himself with strength, dignity, and ease. All of this was bound up in a youthful zest and merciful right will. Immediately, Shemuel knew the special man of Yahuwah's own choice stood before him. Here was Yasharel's second sovereign. Here stood her shepherd king. At last, Shemuel, this is my man. Anoint him for special service. Yahuwah spoke clearly. See 1 Shemuel 16:12. As the stooped patriarch stretched himself on tiptoe to pour his horn of oil over Daoud's dark and shining locks, he little dreamed of the youth's incredible destiny under Yahuwah. Here was a youth called from the solitude of the hills, from the humble care of sheep, from a quiet life of stark simplicity, to become the greatest monarch Yasharel would ever know. No, Yahuwah does not see as man sees. He does not measure character by charisma. He does not defer to human values. Yahuwah's chief criterion for selecting special servants for mighty purposes is, are you willing to do my will? This is the acid test. Despite all of an individual's other failings, if above all else his one consuming desire is to be a man after Yahuwah's own heart or will, he will be lifted above the turmoil of his times in great honor. This was to be true for Daoud. Despite his mistakes, despite his personal disasters, despite the awesome ordeals of his later life, he was to emerge as one whose life would be a benediction to millions across thousands of years of human history. Yahuwah's merciful Ruach came upon the young shepherd in rich measure as the sweet olive oil shone upon his head, face, and shoulders. He was the son of Yesse, a son of Yehuda, an offspring of Yaakov, Yitzchak, and Abraham. More than that, he stood strong in the great tradition and lineage of Yasharel, through whom eventually the Savior of all the world would come to the earth. In this same village of Bethlehem, in the same fields and range from which Daoud had been called, in the same sheltering sheepfold where he had corralled his sheep, would come for those cataclysmic words from on high, for unto you is born this day in the city of Daoud a Savior, which is Yahusha, from Lucas 2:11. It would be well over 1,000 years before that happened. For nearly 1,100 years, the offspring of this newly anointed shepherd king would await the appearance of a sure sign that the great shepherd of all time, the king of all kings, the promised Messiah, Emmanuel, Yahuwah is with us, was among men. His mission accomplished, Shemuel returned in peace and quietness to his home in Ramah. By contrast, Daoud was now suddenly to be thrust into a life of great adventure and dire peril. To the end of his long years, he would know only war, bloodshed, and enormous anguish of spirit. Yet, out of such unpromising material, Yahuwah would bring tremendous honor, fame, wealth, commendation, and beauty of language never matched in another human being. The foundation for such a future under Yahuwah's great hand had been laid in the stem and severe solitude of Daoud's life as a shepherd. Alone with his young spirit open and sensitive to the Ruach of Yahuwah, there had come to him clearly the sterling concepts of inner integrity and personal uprightness which he must show in the king's court. Even though for years yet to come, Daoud would be flung into furious interaction with the tyranny of Shaul, the sense of Yahuwah's Ruach with him never departed. Always, Daoud was a man receptive to the word of Yahuwah, ready to repent of his wrongs, eager above all else to do Yahuwah's will. In this, he and Shaul were poles apart, as different as the bright sun reflected from his sun-kissed face and the black moods that engulfed the sinister soul of Shaul. The record given to us is that, in fact, the Ruach of Yahuwah, grieved and quenched by Shaul's intransigence, departed from him. Instead, there overtook him an evil spirit of such a dreadful disposition that even his associates knew he needed help. Like so many moderns, they assumed music and other mental therapy would cure his condition. What they missed altogether was that Shaul's melancholy was more than mere depression. It was the deep, dark sign of inner sin for which he would never repent, and from which he could never recover in any other way. So it was decided to search for a superb musician, someone who by playing soft, sweet melodies on a harp could bring some relief to Shaul's madness. The choice fell on young Daoud. Word had reached Shaul's court that the sturdy shepherd, along with his other outstanding attributes, was also a fine harpist. It was also reported to the king that Daoud, though only a youth, was an unusual character of remarkable courage. His associates knew well of his fearlessness in protecting his father's flock. He was not afraid to tackle any predator, be it lion, bear, or human raider. Apparently, too, when he was given a chance, he was valiant in battle, yet not foolhardy or rash. He had proven himself to be a persistent and wise young man. It was quite apparent Yahuwah's presence was always with him. With such a high recommendation, Shaul sent for the sturdy shepherd, and when the young countryman stood before the king, there was an immediate attraction for him. In fact, it could be said in modern language, it was love at first sight. For not only did Shaul show a great fondness for Daoud, he immediately appointed him to be his personal armor-bearer. The sudden transition from being a solitary sheepman on the dry, hot rangeland around Bethlehem to the favorite of the king's court did not unbalance Daoud. He was not a man given to personal pride. He was not swayed by the star status thrust upon him. Eventually, he was himself called to be a stalwart servant both to his Yahuwah and to his king. When Shaul was in deep depression, Daoud played for him. When Shaul went into combat, Daoud bore his war gear. When Shaul relaxed, Daoud was a friend to him and his family. As time went on, he became one of the dearest associates Jonathan had ever known. Like a fresh rain from the hills, Daoud brought rich abundance into the dry desolation of Shaul's life and home. Chapter 10. Goliath challenges Yasharel. From 1 Shemuel 17, 1 through 37. Slowly, the uncertain years of Shaul's unsteady rule unfolded. As Shemuel had foretold, Yasharel's king had spent most of his energies in pandering to his own royal interest. The ancient enemies surrounding his nation had not been subdued. Thus Yasharel was highly vulnerable to attack. Young Daoud, too, had led a most unsettling sort of life. Part of the time, he served in Shaul's presence. Part of the time, he tended his father's flock of sheep that grazed the desert range. He was becoming fully at ease in the royal court, yet at the same time, he was hardening into a tough wilderness man. Then suddenly, the restive Philistines from the southwest borders of Yasharel decided to launch a major attack on Yasharel. Since the desperate days when they had been routed by Jonathan's fierce assault, they had regained their strength as a people, and now regrouped their fighting men into a formidable army. It was time to avenge themselves on their adversary. A huge force of warriors moved into Judea. There, they encamped in A huge force of warriors moved into Judea. There, they encamped in Ephes-dammim, the so-called Valley of Blood. A small, shining stream ran through the valley floor. On one slope stood the armies of the enemy, and on the other were ranged the forces of Shaul. Each side put on a bold show of might. The fighting men would march and countermarch back and forth, as if challenging one another to combat. For Yasharel, however, the presence of the Philistines was more terrifying because they were huge men in their ranks. These were the descendants of the Anakim, the giants who struck terror in the first spies sent into Canaan by Moshe some 400 years before. Now, once again, the men of Yasharel may have felt like mere grasshoppers in their presence. This was especially true when they heard the ringing challenges of Goliath. A monster man clad in iron mail echoed across the valley. Basing our calculations on the most conservative values of ancient measurements, the giant was at least 9 feet 2 inches tall. His armor weighed no less than 125 pounds. The head of his massive spear weighed 15 pounds, the equivalent of a modern sledgehammer. Ominously, Goliath clanked back and forth across the slopes, shouting imprecations against Yasharel, defying their men to send over a champion to meet him in mortal combat. If he, the Philistine, prevailed, then all Yasharel should fall prey to his people. If the warrior from Yasharel won, the reverse would be true. It was a perilous time for Yahuwah's people. As was his habit, Shaul, Yasharel's most notable giant, who towered head and shoulders above his peers, simply sat in the cool shade of his tent, pitched beneath the acacia trees of Elah. He was too terrified to pick up the enemy challenge, too intimidated to go to the attack, too fearful to move. No longer imbued with Yahuwah's Ruach, he stood impotent before the enemy. What was true for Shaul was in large measure also true for his men. As goes the leader, so go his followers. So for 40 dreadful days, Goliath stormed and raged across the slopes. His overpowering might struck sheer terror into Yasharel's troops. What was transpiring in the Valley of Blood was a drama that has been acted out in 1,000 ways against Yahuwah's people across the centuries. The giants who come against Yahuwah's own people come in many guises. Their challenges and attacks come in various forms. But always the battle lines are drawn between righteousness and evil, for the enemies of Yahuwah are bent on blood. So often, it seems, the people of Yahuwah appear most powerless before the foe. It is as if they are paralyzed with apprehension. Most are too intimidated to join battle with the forces of evil ranged against them. Then Yahuwah's Ruach moves in power and great energy upon some one person who will dare to meet the challenge. In this moment of Yasharel's national emergency, the person prepared by Yahuwah was young Daoud. He was to be the one energized by the Ruach of the Most High to rescue his people from their peril. His older brothers were away from home, long since recruited into Shaul's standing army. Daoud was the one left behind with his aged father Yesse to care for the stock. But Yesse was restless and concerned for the welfare of his sons in battle. Laden with gifts of food for them and cheese for their officers, Daoud was sent to find out how they fared. To most moderns, especially those of the younger generation, it must come as a severe shock to see Daoud's implicit obedience to his father. Here was a young man of great gifts and unusual abilities, still willing to carry out Yesse's wishes. He did not debate the issue of appearing to his brothers as a mere servant sent on a menial mission. If that was his father's desire, he would do it. Yahuwah's 6th great commandment given to Yasharel centuries before had been, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which Yahuwah, your Elohim, is giving you." From Exodus 20:12. This Daoud did without dispute. At dawn, he was on his way to the Valley of Blood to find out what had become of his brothers. Quickly he had found the commissariat and left his gift of food rations there. Then, boldly, he worked his way into the battle lines to find Eliab and his other brothers. Moving swiftly from company to company, Daoud was shocked to hear the unanswered challenges of Goliath ringing across the valley. Was there no one daring enough in Yasharel to take on this gross giant who defied the armies of Yahuwah? Was there no warrior ready to risk his life for the honor of Yahuwah and country? Was everyone paralyzed with fear? Daoud could scarcely credit the low morale in blank terror of Shaul's men, who fled like frightened sheep at the approach of Goliath. He simply could not believe what he saw. From battle group to battle group, Daoud hurried, searching for his brothers. The Yashreelite units were massed in their thousands upon the sun-blasted slopes, yet none dared join battle with the proud Philistines. Not one was brave enough to descend the slope, cross the stream, and rush the foe in ferocious combat. This was doubtless surprising to Daoud, for he soon learned that Shaul had offered an enormous bounty to any man who slew Goliath. The king had promised a handsome prize of money, the hand of his daughter in marriage, and total tax exemption for the rest of the victor's life. But even with such handsome rewards, the warriors of Yasharel refused to attack. Like timid children, they cringed in alarm while Goliath ranted and raved against them and their Elohim. The whole scene stirred Daoud to the depths. His Ruach, sensitive to Yahuwah's Ruach, could not be silent. He was beside himself with passion for the honor of his people and the esteem of his Yahuwah. Who is this foul Philistine that he should dare to defy the armies of the Most High? He wondered. His voice taut with anger, his face flushed with the thought of battle, the adrenaline pouring into his bloodstream. The young shepherd bounded from platoon to platoon. Not only was he searching for his brothers, he was also searching for some man bold enough to do battle with the foe. At last he came on Eliab. The older brother was not that excited to see Daoud. The precocious young stalwart had always been a pain to his more stodgy siblings. A score of jealous and hostile emotions swept through Eliab. In rapid, stabbing sentences, Eliab lashed out at his brother. "Why are you here? Where did you leave your little band of sheep? Who's caring for them? What do you know about war to be here?" See 1 Shemuel 17:28. Each command was a sharp insult to Daoud. Each was intended to shatter his self-assurance. Each was a put-down for the only person who would dare to charge into combat against Goliath on this cataclysmic day. The taunts did not deter Daoud. He was not to be cowed by his brother's caustic tongue and acid envy. Without engaging in an empty diatribe with Eliab, he simply asked softly, "What have I done that is amiss? Is there not a cause here great enough to consume a man?" See verse 29. What happened to the young shepherd happens all too often in the life of anyone determined to do Yahuwah's will and to serve his cause. Again and again, those who will dare to face the foe, to lock battle with the forces of evil, find themselves harassed by their own family or friends. In fact, Yahushua our-Messiah warned us emphatically this would happen to anyone who followed him, from Matthew 10:29-42. And those who oppose the ardent disciples of Yahuwah himself are sometimes the very people who are supposedly in the forefront of the struggle with evil. It is all a bit difficult. In dismay, Daoud turned from his brothers. He kept asking the same searching question: who will go against Goliath? Someone had to go. If necessary, someone would have to dare to die. The battle simply could not be lost by default. Daoud himself would attack the giant. There was no further holding back. He would go. Hastily, the youth was brought before King Shaul. The towering monarch, fully outfitted in iron armor, looked down on Daoud with a certain air of contempt. What could a simple country lad like this do in battle? "You can't fight Goliath. You're too young. You aren't battle trained. The giant is a combat veteran, from verse 33. Daud was not about to be deterred by Shaul. With blazing eyes and clenched fist, he looked up at the king and replied in steady tones, "Let no man's heart fail him for fear. I will charge Goliath. Yahuwah, Yahuwah who delivered me when I slew both the lion and the bear that came to raid my flock, will also preserve me from the power of this Philistine." From verse 37. This calm, unshakable declaration of quiet confidence in Yahuwah silenced Shaul. All his special arguments and feeble excuses were blown away in the wind of Yahuwah's Ruach, who swept so strongly through Daud's Ruach. One man, in company with his Yahuwah, could turn the tide of fear that overwhelmed a whole army, an entire nation, and its feckless king. He would go in the power of the Almighty. Chapter 11. Daud destroys the giant. From 1 Shemuel, chapter 17, 37 through 58. It is a supreme irony that Shaul, who should have been Yasharel's natural challenger to the giant Goliath, refused to risk his own life. He, the king, was by far the biggest man in the kingdom. He was one of the few fully equipped with a complete suit of iron mail and forged weapons, all of which had come from Philistine armor makers. Even if Shaul had elected not to attack Goliath with such conventional battle gear, he had the unique advantage of a Benjamite. This tiny tribe, a mere remnant in Yasharel, was the most skilled in the use of the sling to slay their foes. So without ever engaging in hand-to-hand combat with Goliath, Shaul could have chosen to try and kill the giant with a stone. But he would not. He was too much of a coward. Instead, he preferred to let Daud go in his stead. With an absurd show of fake concern for the young man's safety, the fickle king insisted Daud put on his massive armor. It was a ludicrous gesture, reflecting Shaul's deranged mentality. The strong, virile young man from the wilderness was bound and cramped by the rigid metal armor that encased his lithe muscles. It was as if he were entombed in iron, the iron forged by the enemy Philistines themselves. "I cannot go with these," Daud exclaimed, putting off the armor. There is a powerful parallel here in the ongoing battles that Yahuwah's people face in every generation. All too often, those entrusted with leadership, like King Shaul, have been fully equipped and armed with trappings taken from the world that opposes them. It is assumed that the techniques and technology forged by human minds and devised by man's methods will suffice to do battle with the forces of evil. Too long, and far too often, misguided leaders try to cramp and constrict their people in the impediments of human design. We become so organized, so structured, so encased with rigid rules, we cannot move forward with Yahuwah. Daud would have none of this. Turning from Shaul with a swift motion, the sturdy shepherd swept up his rod and staff from the ground. He slung his sheepskin bag over his sunburned shoulder. Then he strode off towards the little singing stream in the valley floor, sling in hand. It could well be he even whistled with glee as he stooped by the brook, pausing to carefully select 5 small smooth stones from its murmuring waters. Not a shred of fear clouded his consciousness. He was a man, strong, free, and confident in his natural setting. The blue vault of the burning sky overhead, the warm breeze of air flowing down the valley floor, the brittle, sharp light of the sun on the slopes, These were all familiar to him. But most important, too, was the reassuring presence of Yahuwah's Ruach resting on his Ruach. This contest was Yahuwah's, not just his. With a quick bound, Daoud leaped across the stream. Alone, yet not alone, bold and rugged, he stood on enemy ground. Goliath's challenger had come. At last, after 40 days and 40 nights of insults and oaths, the giant's jeers would be flung back in his own spittle-stained beard. Seeing the bare-legged youth advance toward him, Goliath burst out in more abusive language. "I am but a mongrel, that you come against me with a shepherd's gear?" he scoffed, the sounds rumbling from behind his metal visor. "I will give your carcass to the vultures and the jackals." See 1 Samuel 17:43 and 44. In an outpouring of crude and vile blasphemy, of which military men are often violent masters, Goliath heaped abuse upon Daoud. With insults, disdain, and rising anger, he tried to intimidate his challenger. But Daoud was not deterred by the diatribe. He was not to be cowed by the curses. Wild threats were but empty words. Daoud seemed utterly oblivious to the ranked armies of both Yasharel and the enemy, which ranged over the surrounding hills like a blanket of humanity. He did not seem to see the formidable center stage of the giant amphitheater upon which he now moved as a leading character. All he saw were his own sure hands quietly fitting a small stone into the well-worn cup of the leather sling. He saw the exposed forehead above the giant's angry face as the crucial target for his aim. He was himself cloaked in the presence of the Most High Yahuwah. He was enfolded in the power of his Ruach. The hand and honor and skill of the Almighty were upon him. The battle was against Yahuwah, who sustained him. "You come against me with a spear, a sword, and a shield, but I come in the name of the majesty of Yahuwah, Yahuwah of Yasharel, whom you have defied." See verse 45. It was a moment of tension. For a few brief seconds, silence swept across the scene. Only the soft singing of the stream could be heard. But all of Yasharel's army and all of the Philistines had heard Daoud's ringing challenge. He alone had dared to descend to that brook. He alone had dared to draw his arsenal of stones from it. He alone had dared to leap across it in an open assault on the enemy. The brook, like the ever-flowing will of Yahuwah, is what separated the two armies. The will of Yahuwah is ever the source of a Yali person's strength. The will of Yahuwah is that which decides whether or not we will go to great exploits for Yahuwah. Most of us will not plunge into it or draw from it. Many of us will never dare to see it as our source of strength. Pausing for a few more moments, Daoud cried out in clear, ringing tones, "This day Yahuwah will deliver you into my hand. The battle is Yahuwah's. All the earth will know that there is a living Elohim in Yasharel." See verse 46. The staccato shouts were like bugle notes for battle. The blood raced in his veins. The light of victory gleamed in his bright eyes. A grin creased his flushed face. "In Yahuwah's might, I will smite you. I will take your head from your shoulders. I will provide the buzzards and scavengers with a grisly banquet of Philistine carcasses. Yahuwah will give you into our hands." See verse 46. With a rush, like a leopard leaping to the attack, Daoud launched himself up the hill towards Goliath. The sling whistled ominously as he whirled it over his head. Then the thong was released. The stone struck. The next instant, the giant crashed down the slope, face forward. The blood spurted from the skull shattered by the rock. It was as if he had been struck by a bullet. Daoud rushed up to the prostrate form as Goliath's armor-bearer fled in panic. Picking up the giant's massive sword, he severed his head, the blood and gore spurting from the jugular vein. In triumph, Daoud stood upon the huge hulk. The battle was over. The daring deed was done. It was an instant of intense elation for all Yasharel. It drew all her fighting men into ferocious action. The Philistines fled in wild panic and total disarray. What all of Shaul's military might had been unable to achieve, a single shepherd had done with simple faith in Yahuwah. Faith is a person's own personal, private response to the word of Yahuwah in the character of Yahusha, to the point where they will act upon it in obedience. It is much more than belief. It is perfectly possible for a man or woman to believe much of Yahuwah's declared will, yet never do it. The result is impotence. All of Yasharel's warriors and Shaul himself believed they should have joined the battle with the enemy and driven the invader from their soil. But none of them did. Not one would go against Goliath. The secret of Daoud's success was not only that he believed the battle was Yahuwah's, and that in the case of the Almighty, he would be preserved from harm, but he was bold enough to step out of the ranks and actually attack the giant. This is faith in action. Yahuwah preserves his people as they press the conflict. Yahuwah does his part. He calls upon us to do our share. This Daoud recounts so clearly in his hymns of praise recorded in such psalms as 23, 46, and 64. He is a man whose calm confidence is in Yahuwah, not in man. It is in the Almighty that he finds a cause to live, for at any cost. In Yahuwah, he finds his very life. The destruction of Goliath and rout of the entire Philistine army was a high point in Daoud's career. No wonder the women and girls of Yasharel would dance and sing to one another. Shaul has slain his thousands, but Daoud his 10,000s. From 1 Shemuel 18:7. It had taken patience and perseverance for Daoud to reach this pinnacle of prominence. Some 6 slow, grinding, frustrating years had crept past since the day Shemuel had anointed him to be king over Yasharel. Years replete with reproaches from his family, condescension from Shaul, whom he served, and insults from the enemy. Little did Daoud realize how hard and rough the trail of tears would be that he had yet to tramp. Little did he know how terrible Shaul's cruel tyranny would be, how vicious his jealousy, and how bitter his rage against this one who that day delivered Yasharel from despair. Shaul's first arranged action after the triumph was to demand that Daoud be brought before him. In stinging, absurd questions, he demanded to know who Daoud was, where he came from, and who his father was, as if he did not even recognize the youth who had so often played to appease his moods, as if he did not even know this one who had been his own armor-bearer. In his selfish madness of mind, Shaul was more concerned with who should marry his daughter than giving honor to Yasharel's new hero. Shaul with his convoluted, hot emotions, was setting the stage for a diabolical vendetta against Daoud. Chapter 12. Shaul's jealous rage against Daoud. From 1 Shemuel chapter 18. Though the Philistines had fled in stark terror after Goliath's death, they had not been totally destroyed. The Yashreelites under Shaul seemed incapable of a complete conquest. Instead, they were more intent on returning to raid and loot the enemy tents left behind in wild abandon. Even Daoud himself saw to it that the giant's armor should be stripped from his carcass and kept as a trophy of war. The severed, gory head of the slain giant was taken to Jerusalem as a supreme humiliation. Why, we do not know, for Jerusalem was an enemy stronghold held by the Jebusites. Meanwhile, Shaul insisted that the shepherd should no longer return to Bethlehem to tend his sheep. He was to become a royal resident of his court. Jonathan was thrilled to have his friend so close at hand. In a merciful gesture of esteem, honor, and goodwill, Jonathan, the natural heir to Shaul's throne, took off his princely robe and put it on Daoud. More than that, he garbed the rough outdoorsman in his own royal wardrobe. The final touch of his profound affection was to equip Daoud with his own armor. Rather than having a sense of rivalry for the one Shemuel had anointed to supplant him, Jonathan showed only profound respect. It was a mark of a generous Ruach. This was, in fact, that special dimension of selfless love that is the hallmark of anyone upon whom Yahuwah's Ruach rests. It is, in truth, the very love of Yahuwah, eloquently expressed in a human life. For his part, Daoud did not parade himself before the public to win their popular applause. He was wise enough to remain subservient to his king. His exploits would speak for themselves. Coupled with his quiet reserve, his humility quickly won the hearts of the nation as a popular hero. Probably in response to this national adulation, Shaul appointed Daoud to be commander-in-chief of all his fighting men. But it was a flash-in-the-pan idea, for as word of Daoud's thrilling victory swept across the hills and valleys, the women and girls everywhere began to dance and chant his praises. Shaul has slain his thousands, but Daoud has vanquished his 10,000s. The theme of triumph and adoration enraged Shaul. His twisted emotions burned with flaring jealousy. Instead of taking pride in Yasharel's deliverance through Daoud's hand, he saw the young man now only as a deadly arch-rival. Shaul's humiliation in the songs and dances of the girls degenerated to hostility, then violent hatred for Daoud. A dark, morose, angry mood settled upon his soul. Deep depression engulfed the king's Ruach. With burning malice, he saw Daoud as one destined to capture the loyalty of Yasharel and so supplant him as their sovereign. He would never let this happen if he could prevent it. In a fit of rage, Daoud was summoned to come and play the harp for him. Shaul, like one demented, ranted and raved in torment of spirit. He, who at the outset of his rule had prophesied among the prophets, was now but a raging mouthpiece for the forces of evil that controlled him. Daoud's hands moved softly over the harp strings. The sweet melodies that before had stilled Shaul's anguished soul seemed only to arouse him more. Suddenly, the king grasped a javelin from his side and hurled it with deadly intent at Daoud. In a split second, the harpist ducked. The shining shaft quivered in the wall a few inches above his head. A few moments later, a second spear whistled towards him. In a quick reflex of strong muscles, Daoud escaped by a hair. It was enough. Shaul's deadly intentions were clear. There could be no peace or safety in his presence. Shaul feared Daoud with stark terror because he recognized the presence of Yahuwah upon him. Daoud, in turn, feared Shaul because of the evil Ruach which oppressed the monarch. Under this sort of wretched tyranny, not only would Shaul become an individual of terrible outrages, but he would make Daoud's life a grim ordeal. The consequences would be sorrow, calamity, and tension for both men. Shaul's fiercest attack on Daoud was not with a weapon of iron held in his hand. It was an act of humiliation by a demotion in rank. From being commander-in-chief over the armies of Yasharel and Yehuda, Daoud was reduced to the low rank of a captain over a single regiment of men. Instead of rebelling against such unwarranted discrimination, Daoud accepted the king's orders with equanimity. It speaks much for the young man that he chooses to act discreetly in the face of such provocation, rather than to try to rally public support to his side. Little wonder Daoud was regarded so highly as an unusually wise young leader in Yasharel. For this he became a national favorite, loved by all. This swing in popularity only served to infuriate Shaul further. His angry hostility began to feed on its own self-pity. He knew only outrage and insult because of Daoud's quiet fame among the people. His convoluted emotions began to devise another diabolical scheme for destroying the innocent young man who up to now had done him nothing but right. In an outworking of knavery and deception of the first magnitude, we are horribled by the depths of chicanery to which Shaul descended. He had become a virtual madman, bent on only one vicious end. He would do away with Daoud. He would brook no rival in his realm. He would have Daoud's head at any cost. What Shaul did not know, nor do many today, is that jealousy is one of the most destructive of all sins. It is a grim evil against Yahuwah, others, and ourselves. Jealousy is too often brushed aside as a fickle human weakness. It is much, much more than that, for it bears within it 5 fatal downward steps to ultimate terror and destruction. Here they are, each beginning with the letter H to help us remember them. Hurt, a feeling of personal insult or injury. Hostility, leading to a need for self-preservation. Hate, deep anger and animosity towards others. Harm, taking action to injure someone. Hell, alienation from Yahuwah and men. The ancient Indian tribes of the north summed it up this way: the hated one looks upon the hater and watches him destroy himself. This was the perilous path upon which Shaul had now set his feet. He would never truly repent of his evil intentions. He would never turn from his wicked ways. He would seal his own self-destruction. His next cruel move was to defraud Daoud of the right to his own daughter's hand in marriage. It was common knowledge all across the country that whoever slew Goliath would be given the king's eldest daughter as a bride. Shaul now reneged on that promise, so the promise Merab was instead given to another man. This was a blatant insult. It was designed to humiliate Daoud among his compatriots. But the outcome was to the young man's advantage. Now he would have opportunity to marry Michal, who truly loved him as a national hero. When the word came to the king that a deep affection for Daoud burned within his daughter's heart, he literally rubbed his hands in glee. Here was his chance to lure Daoud into a death trap. Michal could be used as the bait to risk his very life to win her love. What the lion, the bear, the giant Goliath, and his own sharp javelins could not do, a woman's love could accomplish. Shaul sent a tempting message to the sturdy young hero. If you want Michal as your bride, bring me no dowry except for the foreskins of 100 Philistines. See verse 25. It was a crude and cunning offer, gross and debased as the one who sent it. Shaul was sure beyond any doubt that in collecting the scalps, so to speak, of 100 enemy warriors, Daoud would be killed in the attempt. Shaul reasoned that Daoud's romance with Michal would make him so reckless he would gladly lose his life for her love. Shaul was certain that this would be a suicide mission for his arch-rival, but it was not to be. On the contrary, Daoud picked up the scheme with pleasure. He would accept the terms with glad abandon. It was a challenge that stirred his spirit and quickened his pulse. Gathering a band of eager comrades around him, Daoud promptly set off in search of Philistine victims. He was bound to have his beautiful bride at the fearsome cost of hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. What were 100 casualties? In his ardor and daring, the flaming young giant Keller came back with 200 gory tokens of those slain. One by one, the double tally of foreskins were laid out in open view before the demented Shaul. Stripped of all excuses, shamed by Daoud's show of force, silenced before his people, the king was forced to give Michal to the man he dreaded most in all the world. The tables had been turned on Shaul. His best laid schemes had backfired. His insidious devices had only worked out to Daoud's great honor. Now suddenly, this arch foe had become his own son-in-law, a veritable member of his own family. It only added to Shaul's chagrin. It seemed he simply could not win. In his own inner darkness, he detected in some obscure degree that he was really fighting against more than a mere man. He was in conflict with the Almighty Yahuwah, for his presence and his power rested upon Daoud in obvious measure. This terrorized Shaul. His outrage and hostility were against Daoud, yet his personal vendetta was against Yahuwah. In actual fact, he found himself opposed by Yahuwah's Ruach. As for Yasharel, as a nation, Daoud, so handsome, so wise, so valiant, and his beautiful princess had become the darlings of the people. They were royal favorites. Chapter 13. Daoud is driven to flee to Shemuel. From 1 Shemuel 19. The immense popularity Daoud enjoyed with the people infuriated Shaul. His selfish spirit and angry emotions were inflamed with jealousy. His animosity and belligerence knew no bounds. The brighter the young man's reputation shone among his people, the darker and more hideous became Shaul's belligerence. In blind fury, he ordered both Jonathan and all his servants to murder Daoud at the earliest opportunity. He was determined to do away with his rival in outright violence. But he had not reckoned on Jonathan's loyalty to his friend. Jonathan, too, had faced the senseless fury of his father. He knew what it was to have his very life in jeopardy at the hands of this deranged man. Still, he would not be intimidated by the king's wrath. Jonathan alerted Daoud to flee into nearby fields and go into hiding. At a prearranged spot, he would also take his demented father aside and plead with him for clemency. If there ever was a peacemaker, it was this noble prince in Yasharel. Of him, it surely could be said, he is a child of Yahuwah. Respectfully, yet forcefully, Jonathan entreated his father to face the facts. Daoud had never done him any harm. The young shepherd warrior had risked his very life to deliver both Shaul and his army from the Philistines and their giant. More than this, Jonathan reminded the king that all of Daoud's service to him had been above reproach. He soothed him with his music. He served him as a loyal armor-bearer. He commanded his fighting men with great bravery and outstanding success. Why then do you want to sin against this noble servant by slaying him? You want to shed innocent blood without a cause. From 1 Samuel 19:5. Jonathan's defense of Daud seemed momentarily, at least, to sink into Shaul's darkened soul. Somehow he seemed to sense the awful solemnity of his bitter and groundless anger against a right man. So, in a sudden outburst of vehemence, he made a complete turnaround. And swore that Daud would be spared. The tragedy of it all was that Shaul never knew true repentance. He never truly saw the gravity of his terrible evil against Yahuwah and man. He never turned in utter disgust from the desperate outrage of his own sinister selfishness. His apparent forbearance, however, was significantly convincing that Jonathan persuaded Daud to return to the king's court as before. At least it was a temporary reprieve. Once again, it appeared harmony had been restored in the kingdom. Jonathan's courage in confronting his father presents a powerful principle of Yali behavior, which demands our attention. At great risk to himself, both physically and emotionally, Jonathan had challenged Shaul's conduct. The unpredictable king could well have become so enraged he would have slain his own son, or he may have felt so insulted as to banish him from his presence forever. Jonathan's stern and forthright judgment of his father's sin and folly was a high-risk action, but it was honored by Yahuwah, for it produced peace. This class of Yali courage is seldom seen. All too often, people prefer to hide behind the excuse that we are not to judge one another. They forget, it seems, that the people of Yahuwah are clearly instructed to judge all things. See 1 Corinthians 2, verse 14 through 16. It is expected of us that, though we are not to condemn others, we are to be bold enough to pass judgment on evil actions and wrong behavior. We are given clear guidelines in Yahuwah's word as to what is right and what is wrong, what is noble and what is deplorable. We believers do not live in a gray world of shadows and uncertainty. We are people of sharp enlightenment. We must be brave enough, as Jonathan was, to live in that light and call sin what it is. Unfortunately, the temporary truce that prevailed between Daud and his monarch was short-circuited. The Philistines, like insatiable predators, again attacked Yasharel. War broke out, and again Daud and his warriors went into furious counteraction. As before, there was a tremendous slaughter of the enemy, and again Daud returned in triumph. It was too much for the tormented king. Jealousy, rivalry, evil imaginations engulfed his fevered temper. Oppressed by an evil spirit, he burned with black anger. His soul was scorched with the acid of his own horrible animosity. Daud was summoned before him to play his harp. The first few flowing chords had scarcely filled the royal chambers when Shaul suddenly hurled a spear across the room. With instant reflexes, Daud ducked. The glittering shaft struck the wall behind him. In a flash, he could have seized the quivering weapon and plunged it through Shaul's silken robes. Instead, the long-suffering shepherd slipped swiftly from the room. Under cover of night, he sped through the darkness to the sanctuary of his home with Michal. But there was no safety there. Michal, like her brother Jonathan, knew all too well the madness of his father's melancholy moods. She was sure the house would be surrounded with armed men ordered to destroy Daud at break of day. Secretly, She lowered her husband from a remote window in the dark. Like a hunted hart, he would flee through the night in exile from his family. It was a desperate escape. Michal, for her part, had learned the art of deception from her father. His capacity for duplicity and strange intrigue had been passed on to her. She was too full of folly. When Shaul's soldiers demanded Daoud's surrender at dawn, she insisted that he was ill in bed. A second time, the fuming king sent word that Daoud be delivered to him in his bed. When this was done, it was to discover that his daughter had double-crossed him by putting a carved idol under the covers with a pillow of goat's hair at the head. In an outburst of fury, Shaul ranted against Michal for daring to deceive him. Again she lied, claiming her husband had threatened to kill her if she did not help him to escape. This was a brazen betrayal of her husband. It was a cruel, cunning move that turned away her father's wrath from her. It was a crafty scheme that saved her skin, but strained the marriage. She had forfeited not only the loss of her beloved, but every hope she may have ever had of becoming a queen in Yasharel. The price of dishonesty is high indeed. One does not indulge in deception without irreparable damage to one's being. What Michal had watched her father do again and again in his grim vendetta with Daoud, she now was doing herself. And for both her and her sire, the end results would be disaster, intertwined with unrelenting despair. Deception is not something which can be merely brushed aside as human weakness. It is a destructive habit that eventually demolishes the one who indulges in it. In bold contrast to the trickery of Michal, Daoud now sought for the strong counsel of a great man of Yahuwah. He needed more than human comfort. He longed above all else for the sure guidance of Yahuwah's Ruach, the calm reassurance that his sure hope was in Yahuwah. In his extremity, he did not go back to his home village of Bethlehem. He did not return to his own father Yesse or his brothers, nor did he ever feel drawn back to the wild hills and clean wind of his beloved sheep country. Instead, Daoud went to find Shemuel, the venerated prophet of the Most High. Shemuel, who had been a spiritual mentor to Shaul, would now likewise become a spiritual mentor to Daoud. He would take just as much time and trouble instructing this young successor to Yasharel's throne as he had the first king. Not only would Daoud become the military leader for his people, but also their spiritual shepherd. Shemuel, when he withdrew from Shaul after slaying Agag, had not faded away into oblivion. Rather, he had returned to Ramah, his favorite area of the country, and there gathered around him an energetic and zealous group of young men who were under his tutelage as prophets. Eventually, they would take his place as leaders in the spiritual affairs of the nation. Here, Daoud found respite from Shaul's harassment, and here Shemuel encouraged Daoud in his communion with Yahuwah. It is thought that some of Daoud's most moving poems were written at Naoth in Ramah, especially those like Psalm 41, 42, and 119, which recount the power of Yahuwah to preserve his own and the sure guidance of his word if obeyed. In wondrous ways, Daoud had seen the arm of the Almighty displayed in real-life situations to deliver him. He had been spared from the lion, the bear, the giant Goliath, the enemy Philistines, the attacks of Shaul, and every agent set against him. Daoud had discovered that a man is immortal as long as Yahuwah has work for him to do in this world. Yet, even here in company with Shemuel, it seemed his life hung by a hair. 3 times in rapid succession, Shaul sent armed units to arrest Daoud. Each time when they came in sight of Shemuel and his young associates, the king's men came under the impact of Yahuwah's presence in that place. Instead of taking Daud by force, they fell under the power of Yahuwah's Ruach and began to prophesy as the others did. In sheer frustration, Shaul himself set off for Ramah to vent his fury on his quarry. It was a foolish act, for he, too, fell upon the ground. He tore off his royal robe and lay prostrate in the dust. It is not certain whether his utterances were from Yahuwah or from the evil spirit which oppressed him. Obviously, even his contemporaries could not be sure, for they asked in awe, "Is Shaul also among the prophets?" See verse 24. His diabolical behavior did little to confirm such a conclusion. Chapter 14. Daud and Jonathan's friendship. From 1 Shemuel, chapter 20, 1 through 42. Even though Daud was in Shemuel's company at Ramah, once Shaul found him there, he no longer felt secure. In desperation, like a deer hounded in the hunt, he again fled for his life. Daud, strange to say, still did not return to his home at Bethlehem, or the security of the wilderness he knew so well. He chose rather to return to see Jonathan, his dearest friend. Somehow, he needed to be reassured that he could survive the assaults of the mad king. Perhaps Jonathan could once again act as an intermediary, a peacemaker between the two. At this stage of his life, the sturdy shepherd was very sensitive in Ruach to the will and wishes of Yahuwah. His long interludes of solitude with the sheep out on the range, his quiet communion with the Most High in the sanctuary of his own soul, his private tutelage from Yahuwah's prophet Shemuel, had fashioned a man of unusual forbearance and rare spiritual qualities. His record so far, before both Yahuwah and men, had been above reproach. He had experienced a meteoric career that commanded public attention, yet it was free of falsehood or deception. His name, now a household word through all of Yasharel, was held in the highest esteem. He was a hero to his people, not only for his daring exploits in the face of great danger, but also because of his noble character and impeccable conduct. So in truth, and on very good grounds, he could demand of Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" From 1 Shemuel 20, verse 1. This was not an exaggeration. It was a terse statement of truth. This was no time for theatrics between the two men. Daud's life was in jeopardy from Shaul. This put a tremendous strain on both Daud and his friend. For in spite of his intense affection for Daud, Jonathan still felt a strong filial loyalty to his father. It was virtually a case of blood runs thicker than the milk of human kindness. Jonathan tried to reassure Daud that he was certain no sinister evil would destroy him. Perhaps he somehow sensed with deep spiritual intuition that Yahuwah's hand was upon his rugged friend to spare him for great future exploits. No matter what his father demented designs, it seemed that Jonathan knew Daud would survive to supplant him. It stands as a great credit to Daud that, in spite of the terrible attacks from Shaul, he did not seek revenge by driving a wedge between him and his son. Not once did Daud allow any desires he may have had to enjoy Jonathan's companionship in this crisis to cause a family rift between father and son. He was wise enough to honor the integrity of Jonathan's home. So staunch was Daud in his loyalty to both Shaul and Jonathan that ultimately, even in their death, he could declare to all the world, Shaul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. From 2 Shemuel 1:23. It is a remarkable measure of Daud's generous ruach towards the royal family that he refused, even under the utmost provocation, to create a breach between them. Few men are this magnanimous. Most would have used their affection for the younger member to destroy the bonds of love between father and son. But Daud would have none of this. He had enormous respect for the sovereignty of Shaul, even though he was a terrible tyrant. He held the sanctity of his home and household in greater esteem than his own survival, for it was of Yahuwah's own special appointment and anointing. This was so true that Daud looked Jonathan full in the face and demanded that if he must die now at the hands of this family, it should be Jonathan's hand that did the dreadful deed. This incredible and moving depths of their friendship is here seen in pulsing clarity. Daud is prepared to die, if need be, for the welfare of his friend, while Jonathan, for his part, is ready to risk his very life to determine what his father might do to destroy Daud. Each was prepared to die for the other. This is a clear reflection of the stirring love of Yahuwah shed abroad in the spirit of both young stalwarts. It is a demonstration of that heavenly supernatural love spoken of so often in the New Testament, a love that lays down its life for another. Because of such sterling love between the two men, they could ventilate their most profound convictions without fracturing their friendship. Obviously, there were strong differences of opinion. Daud was sure Shaul was determined to destroy him. Subsequent events proved him right. Jonathan seemed equally convinced that his father, though a victim of passing evil moods, meant no permanent harm to Daud. This seemed strange in light of Shaul's repeated attempts to kill Daud, either in the privacy of his royal quarters at Naoth or in his assignments against the Philistines. At any rate, Daud was determined to discover what Shaul's true intentions were. So it was agreed on that special feast day of the new moon, he would absent himself from the royal table. If he were missed by the monarch, then Jonathan would plead his cause with the excuse that Daud had returned home to Bethlehem for a festive family reunion. It seemed a small pivot point upon which a man's entire life would turn. But Daud was desperate at this point in his stormy career. He grasped at any straw in the wind that could give direction to his future. The two men, being keen outdoorsmen, went out into a secluded spot in the nearby countryside. Here they would meet again 3 days later, after Jonathan had sounded out Shaul. But first they undertook to make solemn vows of lifelong loyalty to each other. They were entering into a compact of consummate allegiance to one another. No matter how violent or tragic events might become, their mutual friendship would never be sundered. Jonathan loved Daud as he loved his own soul. He was determined that even if it meant that they should never see each other again, he would leave no stone unturned to warn his friend of impending peril. He was ready to forfeit the sweet consolation of his company to spare his life. For Jonathan, with profound spiritual perception, knew full well that he himself, though the first prince in Yasharel, would never ascend to his father's throne. He was alert to the fact that Daud was Yahuwah's chosen prince, anointed of Shemuel years before to supplant him. Yet there was no ill will or rivalry in his heart. Just as Daud respected Shaul as Yahuwah's anointed, so likewise Jonathan regarded Daud as Yahuwah's appointed king. He knew he would establish a new dynasty of rule in Yasharel, so an agreement was made between the two that out of honor for Yahuwah's intentions and integrity to each other, no harm would befall either family. It was an unbreakable bond of astonishing generosity. Even after Jonathan's untimely death, Daoud honored his oath to his offspring. As Daoud had earlier suspected, Shaul was angered by his absence from the banquet. When Jonathan was pressed about the matter, he replied that his friend had begged leave of absence to visit his own family in Bethlehem. Shaul flew into a storm of fury. Typical of a schizophrenic, he raged against the imagined plot against himself. He was sure his son Jonathan would betray him. He was convinced that some dire scheme had been devised to usurp his throne. In a wild outrage, the unbalanced monarch heaped abuse on Jonathan. He slandered his mother, insulted his son, and in the process behaved worse than any brute beast. Caught up in the terrifying toils of the dark spirit that seared his soul and scorched his spirit, Shaul raved on like a maniac. In a storm of ferocious frenzy, he railed on against his son. The oaths and curses spilled from his quivering lips in a rush of verbal abuse. A black scowl creased his face, which was flushed with anger. His eyes blazed with burning hate. His huge hulk trembled with the convulsion of his contempt. Seizing a spear, he flung it in fury at young Jonathan. The javelin would have skewered him to the wall, but he ducked from its flight. Now his own temper flamed white hot. No longer was he in doubt about his father's design. He must warn Daoud. By a prearranged plan, Jonathan went out to the fields with a small lad. He took his bow and some arrows with him, pulling it taut, his temper tightening his muscles. He shot the arrows far beyond the boy. It was the signal that all was not well at home. Daoud would know for certain that there was no hope of his return to Shaul's service. The little lad was ordered to go in search of the arrows shot far over his head. As he did, Daoud came out of hiding. The lad, meanwhile, had been sent back to the city. He should not see the two princes fall into each other's arms. It was too tender, too precious, too moving a moment. This was not a reunion. It was, in essence, a parting of paths. There was no place here now for further conversation, no time for more talk, no need for further discussion. Both men, strong, upright, powerful warriors, fearless in combat, embraced fondly. Their affirmations of deep affection were punctuated with sobs of sorrow. This was the place of parting. Each bound in unbreakable commitment to the other would meet again only once. They parted in peace. Jonathan would return to the royal city. Daoud would go in permanent exile in the wilderness waste. It was Yahuwah's arrangement for them. It was Yahuwah the Almighty, who alone could preserve both men in peace until death did them part forever. 15. Daoud at Nob, from 1 Shemuel, chapter 21. Up until this point in his remarkable young life, Daoud's reputation had been without reproach. His conduct, both at home and in the king's court, had been magnificent beyond his years. His record in battle had been heroic, yet fierce as a falcon. He was a national hero who had won the hearts and favor of his generation. The merciful Ruach of Yahuwah, who rested upon him in such effulgence from the time of his special anointing under Shemuel's hand, had imparted to Daoud unusual wisdom and remarkable discretion. He moved surely as one guided by Yahuwah, whom he loved dearly and followed with complete trust. His early psalms and songs written during this period of his career reflected this quiet confidence in the Most High. His years of solitude with his sheep, the quiet nights alone under the pulsing stars. His long, lonely days beneath the desert wind had given him ample opportunity to be still in spirit, serene in his ruach before Yahuwah. It was the spiritual legacy of his outdoor life in poignant times of intense communion with Yahuwah, which enabled him to compose such exquisite poems as Psalm 8, 19, and 104. The very words ring with the majesty of the Almighty. What is man that you remember him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? From Psalm 8:4. As has been well said, Daoud was the sweet singer of Yasharel. Then suddenly, upon parting with Jonathan, Daoud's entire deportment took a violent turn of direction. It was as though the pain of separation from his dearest friend, the unrelenting fury of Shaul, the isolation from his wife and family, combined to twist his soul and shrivel his normally buoyant ruach. Instead of relying upon Yahuwah for guidance as he had done before, Daoud turned in upon himself, choosing rather to rely on his own human instincts for survival. It was a dreadful decision. The consequences would be so catastrophic that it would mean the painful death of innocent people, as well as the defamation of his character. Daoud's feet would be set on a downward trail of despair and destruction. His hands would become stained with the blood of terror and desolation. To be fair to him, we must see that at this point, Daoud felt enormous frustration. He had been separated from his closest friend. He had lost all favor with the king's court. He had been exiled from his wife and family associates. He was suddenly a desperado on the run. He, who had been anointed to be king over his people, was now more like a wild partridge hunted in the hills, taking flight to escape his foes. For reasons not stated in the record, Daoud felt his only recourse was to seek safety with the Philistines, his ancient enemy. He would seek asylum with Achish, the king of Gath. In his flight, he did not turn again to Shemuel, but stopped instead to see the priest, Ahimelech, at Nob. The name Nob means nothing. Evidently, it was a nondescript spot where Ahimelech, an even less revered priest, was in residence. He was terrified when Daoud turned up at his place all alone. Usually, the young commanding officer was accompanied by a band of fighting men. Somehow, Ahimelech sensed something was wrong. He began to query Daoud, but his questions were brushed aside. Instead, the fugitive, for the first time, resorted to outright deception. Daoud insisted that the king had sent him on a secret mission, that this special assignment was strictly the king's business. He implied that it called for prompt action and daring disregard for any spiritual inhibitions that might stand in the way. Of course, all of these statements were essentially lies. They were flagrant falsehoods, couched in language of duplicity and deception. The subtle art of saying one thing while meaning another is an ancient form of subterfuge. It has become a hallmark of our 20th century society in the Western world. Still, it was an insidious method of double dealing in which Daoud now indulged to gain personal advantage. The supposed king on whose business he had come was not Shaul at all. It was the synonym for Daoud himself, who, having suddenly taken matters into his own hands, saw himself as king in his own castle. Was he not anointed to be king? He would act as such. Immediately, Daoud demanded that the hapless priest should provide him with provisions for his journey. The terrified Ahimelech protested weakly that he had no bread in hand except the set-apart showbread of the set-apart place. Daoud, in an uncharacteristic show of impatience, swept aside the weak priest. He insisted that he be given 5 of the small set-apart loaves set aside for the service of Yahuwah. Ahimelech, in a divided mind, was hesitant to let Daud have the set-apart loaves, lest he defile himself and desecrate their use. Again, in a flagrant act of contempt for the spiritual traditions of the priesthood, Daud swept away all of Ahimelech's objections. After all, he argued, both he and his men, none of whom were with him, had not been defiled for days. So why should there be any grounds for withholding the bread from one going into battle? As we contemplate the account, 2 things overwhelm the senses. The first is Daud's contempt for the set-apart traditions of Yasharel's Levitical ordinances. It is as if he suddenly deemed these of little consequence. He would bludgeon any person, even the priest, to meet his need. He would tell a lie to achieve his goal. Unfortunately, both for Daud and the priest Ahimelech capitulated to Daud's demands. Instead of standing strong for the honor of Yahuwah, he gave in to the young warrior. Obviously, Ahimelech was out of touch with Yahuwah. For rather than turning Daud back to seek his strength and confidence in Yahuwah, he simply added to his despair by granting him his unlawful desires. The pathetic priest should have had enough spiritual courage to remind Daud of the great things Yahuwah had done on his behalf in the past, but he did not, and so he failed miserably in his office. Next, Daud demanded weapons of war. It was a vivid indication of how far he had turned from his trust in the Most High. And why should he feel a priest could supply him with a sword, shield, and spear is difficult to understand. The more so when it was he himself who came against the giant Goliath without such armaments. Daud had shouted in ringing challenge for all the world to hear, "You come against me with sword, shield, and spear, but I come to you in the name of Yahuwah." Again, the tragic Ahimelech, knuckling under to Daud's demands, apologized that he had nothing in hand except the massive sword of Goliath. For some obscure reason, the great ungainly weapon was wrapped in a cloth and lay beneath the priest's ephod. It really did not belong there. But still, the weak-kneed priest dragged it out and handed it over to Daud. The very sight of the shining steel aroused the blood in Daud's veins. "Give it to me," he glowered. Unfortunately for both Daud and Ahimelech, a man called Doeg, Shaul's chief mule and donkey handler, stood in the shadows nearby and watched all that went on. He would report back to the king all the details of this dreadful day. Unwittingly, Ahimelech, by his cooperation with Daud, was sealing not only his own doom, but also that of his entire family. The outworking of his weak and hopeless compromise with Daud would destroy himself and lead Daud into the desert of spiritual degradation. If Ahimelech had truly been Yahuwah's spokesman, he would have known Daud's duplicity. He would have stood against his wrongdoing. He would have turned him from his wicked ways. He would have reassured him of Yahuwah's faithfulness and his capacity to succor him in this time of crisis. But the priest did not do this. Entrusted with the spiritual leadership of his people, he failed both Yahuwah and man. It is a most solemn warning to those who stand between Yahuwah and men today. Like Ahimelech, many encourage their people to find their resources in the world and in its ways, when all the time they should be turning their people to Yahuwah. Unlike the fearless Daud of former times, the young warrior now fled in panic toward the coastal region of the Philistines. He was afraid of Shaul, afraid of the future, afraid of his own web of falsehood that he was weaving around his own life, afraid even of the enemy, whom he once held only in contempt. When Daud came to Gath, the Philistine stronghold where Achish was king, his arrival was greeted with utter disbelief. The enemy simply could not believe that this was Yasharel's most notorious and fabled warrior. Surely it was impossible that the fearless commanding officer of Yasharel's armed men should be at their city gates, a mere refugee. In astonishment, the Philistines refused to let him enter. Surely he was bent on mischief. He must have ulterior designs. Wasn't he the one who had slain Goliath? He was the one of whom the women sang, Shaul has slain his thousands, but Daoud his 10,000s. In mortal terror for his life, Daoud decided on another strategy. He would surely perish at the hands of the very warriors he had routed in battle. Achish would have him slaughtered. There was only one escape. He must feign madness. It was known Shaul was a madman. Why not he? With gobs of saliva spilling down over his dark beard, Daoud clawed and scrabbled with his fingers on the city gates. With garbled sounds and fiendish cries, he tried to force his way into the city like one demented. But Achish would have no part of his performance. The pagan king could see through the subterfuge. He had more spiritual perception than Ahimelech the priest. As for Daoud, it was one more dreadful downward step into the darkness of his own self-degradation. Chapter 16. Daoud, an outlaw and fugitive. From 1 Shemuel, chapter 22. In desperation, since Achish would not offer him asylum, Daoud fled into the wilderness. There, like a hunted quarry, he took refuge in a remote rock cave. Its exact location has been disputed by scholars, but it may very well have been one of the desert hideouts not far from Bethlehem, with which Daoud was familiar from his days as a shepherd. Here, amid the rough rock formations, Daoud felt the security of a sturdy outdoorsman who can survive by his wilderness skills. Here his untamed spirit was not shackled by the constricting niceties of civilization. Daoud was really a rugged outlaw, banished by Shaul, exiled now from the soft comforts of the king's court. Word of his whereabouts quickly came to his family and relations not more than a few miles away. Out of concern and loving loyalty to him, they soon joined the growing band of malcontents that began to gravitate to the young national hero. It was as if a strong and sinister underground movement was taking form in Yasharel. Many had become hostile to Shaul. Long before Shaul had even been anointed king, the venerable old Shemuel had warned the nation of this. He told them emphatically the new monarch would oppress them. Now his predictions had proved true. The result was a host of men who felt plundered, wronged, and abused by Shaul, now gathered as a rebel force around Daoud. His wild fortress became the focal point of the nation's discontent. It is a measure of Daoud's unusual discretion that he decided his parents and near of kin should not be put in jeopardy because of him, so he made a swift cross-country excursion to Moab, east of the Dead Sea. This was the hot and formidable region from which his ancient maternal roots had come. Ruth, the remarkable Moabite widow who married Boaz, was his great-great-grandmother. In Moab, Daoud made arrangements for his aged parents to take refuge in comparative safety. At least they would escape any outrageous attack Shaul might try to make on them as retribution for Daoud's actions. One never knew what mad and rash move the angry and unbalanced monarch might make. Daoud, meanwhile, now in hiding, longed to discern what future role he should play in Yahuwah's plans for him. Though his own duplicity and deceit with Ahimelech had brought him down to this desperate point in his career, he still yearned for Yahuwah's highest purposes. The remarkable aspect of his character combined with a contrition of ruach that was ever ready to repent in humility of heart and will, endeared him to the Most High. It was amid the darkness and desperation of the cave of Adullam that Daud composed Psalm 34 and 56. Yahuwah is near to the brokenhearted, and he saved those whose spirit is crushed. Many are the evils of the righteous, but Yahuwah delivers him out of them all. From Psalm 34, verse 18 and 19. Such truths have stirred the souls and quickened the spirit of Yahuwah's people for well over 3,000 years. They have been the cry of confidence for the oppressed from generation to generation, whether under the tyranny of Shaul or the iron heel of 20th century dictators. Amid his grief, amid his exile, amid his rebel comrades, Daud was learning firsthand the frustration and anguish of the oppressed. He would develop an enormous empathy for the underprivileged of his people. Never would he be immune to the suffering of his subjects when in due time he became their monarch. In the caves, the wildest hideouts and desert waste of a fierce and hostile region, Daud was binding the hearts of his comrades to him with strands of steel-like love and loyalty. No king had ever before tasted the bitter fruit of utter alienation as he did now. No monarch would endure such humiliation, abuse, and degradation at the cruel whims of his oppressor. Because of all this, in due course, he would become the most beloved ruler ever to reign in Yasharel, for he knew fully what it was to be the underdog in society. He had been among the poorest of the poor. He had literally tasted the very pangs of death as his life stood ever in peril. We do well to remind ourselves that in the fullness of time, another, greater than Daud, monarch of the universe, Yahusha, the Anointed, suffered in the same manner for all of us. Shaul, meanwhile, had returned to his home village of Gibeah. There, in the cool shade of the feathery tamarisk trees, he held court from day to day. It was a typical scene with the local people hovering around, listening to the pompous personage regale his audience with political propaganda. The arrogant tyrant was in an expansive mood. Word had come to him that Daud had been discovered. He was now in hiding in the forest of Hereth. Here he could soon be brought to bay. It would be much easier than trying to take him in his rocky fortress. It had been a bold step of strong faith and quiet obedience for Daud to leave his cave of security and go to Hereth, but that had been Yahuwah's clear command to him through the prophet God. Because of his prompt compliance with the will of Yahuwah, his life would be spared, as well as those of his men. Others, less fortunate, would fall under the mad fury of Shaul's cruel, avenging temper. Even innocent men, women, and children would be annihilated in his bitter anger. Day after day, Shaul harangued his hearers. Spear in hand, he strutted his stuff, giving vent to the angry emotions that boiled up within his being. He was sure all of Yasharel was set against him. He roared that his contemporaries had conspired with Daud to overthrow him. He bellowed like a bull, enraged that even his son Jonathan was a traitor to him. He challenged the nondescript crowd that came to hear him. Will Daud get every one of you fields, vineyards, and special commissions in the army? See 1 Shemuel 22:7. Could the son of Yesse ever make up to them what he himself had taken from them? The convoluted thinking of his deranged mind was a tortured tirade against even his own associates. Shaul seemed to see in everyone a potential enemy. He felt even his closest friends and family members were traitors who had betrayed his trust. Letting his imagination run riot, he accused them all of subterfuge. They were making dastardly schemes to destroy him. He was sure every man's sword was set against him. In sickening self-pity and wretched, blind, jealous rage, he ranted on against his subordinates. Precisely at this point, The crafty Doeg stepped forward from the mob. It was the opportunity he had waited for to integrate himself with the tyrant. They were two of a kind, both ruthless, warped men. It was more than just their common love of donkeys that had drawn them to each other. Their twisted, hostile spirits found mutual attraction in one another, like springs of tempered metal intertwined. Doeg, with gloating words and smoldering eyes, recounted to Shaul how he had stood in the shadows watching the priest Ahimelech aiding and abetting Daud. He had sought the counsel of Yahuwah for the young fugitive. He had given him bread for strength, Goliath's sword for battle. In burning fury, Shaul commanded that the priest and all his family, as well as the other lesser priest at Nob, be summoned into his presence at once. He would not brook a moment's delay. He himself would question Ahimelech's outrageous conduct. When they came, Shaul was beside himself with rage, demanded to know why the priest had aided Daud. Ahimelech replied without rancor or disrespect. He simply insisted that Daud was due all the courtesy extended to him. After all, wasn't Daud the commanding officer in Yasharel's army? Wasn't he the one who, above all others, had been faithful in serving both the nation and Shaul? Wasn't he the one who had conducted himself with such dignity in Shaul's court? Wasn't he Shaul's own son-in-law, married to his own daughter? Surely such a noble person in the nation was deserving of his service. He had only done his duty. Ahimelech's reply only added fuel to the flames of Shaul's fury. Leaping to his feet, towering like a smoldering inferno over the unfortunate priest, the mad monarch roared, "Ahimelech, you and all your father's family will surely die for this." He turned to the armed guards who stood around him and commanded them to kill the priest. They refused to obey. They would not lift their hands against Yahuwah's anointed servants. What courage! Not to be deterred, Shaul turned to his head donkey driver, Doeg. "You do the dirty work." Without a second thought, Doeg, the pagan Edomite, drew his sword and slaughtered the helpless priest. In cold blood, without a tinge of remorse, the cruel Canaanite hacked and butchered 85 men to death before the bloodthirsty Shaul. Unarmed, clad only in their priestly robes, the victims of such outrageous violence went down like dry weeds cut by a sieve. Blood ran across the ground, soaked the soil, and seared the crass conscience of the king. He was not done. The next day, Doeg would destroy every remaining vestige of life at Nob. Men, women, servants, children, infants, livestock, all would be wiped out. Nob literally became nothing. Shaul, who deliberately refused to obey Yahuwah and do this to Amalek, had not hesitated to do it to this special household of the Most High. Such was his utter perverseness of spirit. Only one priest escaped the terrible assassination. It was young Abiathar, who fled to Daud and recounted the carnage. Daud was man enough to realize that the root cause of the catastrophe had been his own deception. Without excuse or flim-flam, he bore the blame for the dreadful bloodbath. No man lives to himself. The consequences of our actions go on to fulfillment. Daud's only remaining consolation to Abiathar was, "Remain with me, do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you are safe." From 1 Samuel 22:23. What faith